Hey there, art nerds. So today I am taking a look at Whale's tube watercolors. And those of you who hang out with me, those of you who watch what I do, you might be wondering, like, Becca, I thought you were done with like Amazon watercolor stuff. Like, I thought the student grade showdown more than filled that for you. And you're right, these aren't just any Amazon watercolors. I have reason to believe that these are actually superior watercolors that are being released by Whale. And I like superior watercolors. I have reviewed several of their products here on the channel, from that folding fan palette to the folding screen palette to the weird phone watercolor case thing to their master level watercolors. I have talked about superior quite a bit on the channel. I have field tested superior watercolors several times here on the channel. So I have reason to believe that the Whale watercolors might be a good, affordable fit for people who are interested in something kind of in between student grade and professional grade. And I have reason to believe that these might be a good option if I were to release watercolor kits with printouts of my art on watercolor paper, and I was looking for a decent quality but not overly expensive watercolor to include with those kits. So that's what we're going to be finding out today. Are these as good as the other superior products that I've talked about here on the channel? And would these be a good fit for a watercolor kit? So I am really looking forward to unboxing and swatching the Whale tube watercolors for you guys today. Hey there, art nerds. Today we're taking a look at Whale artist watercolors. And you guys might be wondering, why Whale? Isn't this just an Amazon brand? Supposedly, rumor has it, these are the fabled superior watercolor tubes that have been rebranded for Amazon market. So I'm looking forward to checking these out and sharing these with you guys. These were purchased on Amazon using a Black Friday deal, or from that time period. So the price that they're going for now is probably not the price that I paid, and I'll go ahead and show you guys what they're going for now to give you guys a good idea of if these are a decent value for you. I should probably let you guys know that I'm actually working on the Vermilion pigments unboxing simultaneously while working on this Whale / superior unboxing. I probably will end up comparing them in this video rather than in the Vermilion video, because I'm going to be comparing the Vermilion against, other Vermilion products. But it does seem like those two sets would be comparable student grade tube-based watercolors. They're both from China. In general, I like some of what both brands bring to the table. And this is my other contender for, I might put this into kits, just so that I can offer paints at a lower price point that are still good. Like, that's part of why we're doing this testing, to see if this would be a good fit for some of my art fit kits. If it doesn't pass the test though, it's not going in the kits. So first things first, let's go ahead and get this cut open. The front says Whale, Artist Watercolor, 24 colors in tubes. On the back, we actually have our color names, numbers, pigment information. We have our transparency guide. This is probably going to be pretty helpful. I'm not entirely sure if there's going to be any paperwork inside, or if there is going to be listings on the tubes or what. I should also point out that I found out that Whale is potentially a white labeled superior from the Frugal Crafter. So big thanks on that tip. I really appreciate it. And also, I purchased this set when she had them listed on her community tab as part of one of her, she lets people know when there's good sales going on. And I found out about this during Black Friday because she posted about this. So thank you, Lindsay, because I like saving money, and this has been in my cart for a year now, ever since you first told me that these are actually superior, and I've been waiting for the price to go down, and for some reason Honey didn't let me know. So I do appreciate the tip, because I did save a good amount of money by actually buying them when they were on sale like that. So inside, okay, decent quality cardboard box, maybe a little nicer than the Mei Liang box, which was kind of a thinner, cheaper cardboard. Inside, we have a little bit of paperwork. Please visit artwhale.com for more information. Very similar to what Superior includes for their swatch cards. All the information is on here also. I appreciate this. Use this paper palette to make your own watercolor chart. Dip your brush into clean water, blah, blah. So basically just instructions. And then they also have some socials, but they don't actually say what those socials are. Like, I don't know that they are Art Whale on all of these sites. They just have a graphic. Inside, we have, they claim that these are 5 fluid ounce tubes. So these are pretty big tubes, much bigger than the Mei Liang 5 milliliter tubes. And the color name is on here, the color number is on here, and the pigment information is on here. Actually, these are pretty promising. These don't look to be ointment tubes at all. These are normal tubes of paint. That is already exciting. So we might have a winner on our hands. So what I want to do today is I'm going to set these up in half pans. I'm going to swatch them while they're still wet, let them dry out for a week, and then swatch them again. I'm going to save this chart for when I re-swatch them from dry, because just in my experience, my own personal preference, I find that I like watercolor typically better after it's had a chance to dry out and set up in half pans. Just my preference. Different artists work different ways. Speaking of, if you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator. I paint the watercolor comics 7-inch Cara. I have painted hundreds of watercolor comic pages at this point, and I review art supplies for fun and to help you guys find art supplies that you'll genuinely like and that will help you make art a habit. I'm also an art education teacher. I teach kids, teens, and adults watercolor, comics, and drawing. So when I'm reviewing student grade stuff like this, I'm thinking about my students and if this would be a good fit for their needs or if it would just be a major disappointment. I firmly believe that finding the right art supplies for you can help unlock a love of a media, whereas finding bad art supplies or being sold bad art supplies can sometimes turn people off to a media. And my goal is to get as many people as possible to make art a part of their life, because I firmly believe that if you enjoy art, it's going to make your life richer. It's going to help you just kind of take a little bit of control of your time. It's going to make you a more creative person. It's going to improve your problem solving skills, and it may make you appreciate art and other artists just a little bit more. So I've got a little bit of an ulterior motive here. I want to create a world that is more artist friendly. And to do that, it means I have to make all of you guys artists. So that's the lens that I'm going to be looking at this today. It would really mean a lot to me if you took a moment to check out my art. You can check out my comic as a webcomic at 7inchcara.com. You can look at my art as like a portfolio. It's not really a portfolio, but at instagram.com/natosoup. Or it would really mean a lot to me if you find that you enjoyed today's review to leave a like and consider subscribing and clicking the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see more from me. For today's review, I'm going to be making my own custom mini palette using this empty pencil tin. I buy these in bulk. On Amazon, it's a little bit cheaper than buying watercolor palettes, and it serves much the same purpose. I have some empty half pans, and I have some magnets. This is a 24 color set, and depending on how the swatching goes, I may compare this to some of the other Superior products that I own. So the first thing I need to do is to go ahead and get these tube watercolors set up in the half pans. I recorded this review after I'd started working on the Mei Liang pigment tube review. So these were kind of recorded at around the same time. And something I noticed while filling these half pans is that these are thick, creamy paints. I did see a lot of separation with the Azo yellow medium, and I'm wondering what the binder is for these watercolors. These are a lot thicker than the Mei Liang pigments tubes, which were much more liquidy and really settled down into the half pans as they dried. Otherwise, I didn't really have any problems while filling these half pans. And I'm not aiming for like a perfect fill with these. I'm just trying to get enough so that I can do all the tests and do a field test for you guys. We'll have the full pigment color, number, transparency, and light fast information down in the description below for you guys in the show notes. But the colors in this set are Permanent Yellow, Azo Yellow Medium, Permanent Orange, Vermilion, Permanent Red Light, Madder Lake Deep, Permanent Red Violet, Light Oxide Red, Burnt Sienna, Permanent Yellow Green, Hooker's Green Deep, Olive Green, Sap Green, Phthalo Green, Ultramarine Deep, Cerulean Blue, Permanent Blue Violet, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Umber, Van Dyke Brown, Ivory Black, and Payne's Gray. So now that we've got these decanted, it's time to swatch them. Unfortunately, I had stepped out for about an hour to run some errands, so these have had a little bit more time to dry than these. If anything, it'll make these a little bit easier to work with than these. I'm just noting it because if it makes a difference. Today, as always, we're going to be swatching on Blick Cotton Rag watercolor paper. This is what we do pretty much all of our swatching on, and it gives me a nice consistent base of comparison, and it's a cotton rag paper. So if these paints are going to perform well, their best chance is going to be on a cotton rag paper like this one. With our initial while still wet in the half pan swatches, I noticed that these are a little easier to control than the Vermilion pigments. The Vermilion were too runny and made color control really difficult. The colors seem bright both in pile tone, as in the half pans, and in mass tone, as in the swatches we're doing here before we add water. And I wonder if this means a lot of optical brighteners were used to get those really appealing colors. The colors do seem to flood the wash. They might be very finely milled. I'm not seeing like dye-based weirdness yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a lot of extender in these. I had a little bit of color control with these out of the pans while still wet, though not as much trouble as I had with the Vermilion. So I'm going to let these dry out for a week, and then we're going to re-swatch them. All right, so it has been more than a week. Our superior watercolors have had plenty of time to dry, and hopefully you guys can see how much they've kind of pulled away from the sides and how several of them have cracked, although they do still seem to be in pretty secure, well, not this one, not the Cerulean blue. Otherwise, they seem to be in there pretty securely. So I think I probably mentioned this earlier, but I am considering doing art kits. And this is one of two brands that I am considering as kind of the paint option, something that performs well, but is quite affordable. And we're going to see today if the superior tubes fit the bill. I'm also hoping that we can compare these against the superior professional watercolors, the superior student grade watercolors, and possibly against Vermilion, or maybe even one of the weird superior formats. So we still have a whole lot of paint swatching to do. So something I want to point out before we start swatching is we're actually seeing a fair amount of color lightening with these, like this blue here, and some of the yellows, some of the reds. You can see like almost like a lighter version of that color on top. Usually what that tells me is that we've got a good amount of optical brighteners that have been mixed in. PW6 is sometimes used as an optical brightener, and what that does is it makes your watercolors seem more bright, vivid, and appealing in the half pans, but it can make your watercolors more chalky, it can make them a little more opaque, It's not necessarily the worst thing. It kind of depends on what you're painting and what you're looking for in your paints. But you guys know me, I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator. I do loads and loads of glazes and layers. So typically I don't want to see a whole lot of optical brighteners in my paints. These paints reactivated quickly and easily, and they have a whole lot of color, and they tend to flood the wash immediately. So if you're looking for interesting wet into wet mixes, these may not be the paints for you. The colors are very bright and they seem to pop off the paper. It's easier to handle these paints in this form for me, but that's why I swatch both ways. I know some people like to work with their watercolors while they're still wet, and some prefer them set up in half pans. So we swatch both ways for you guys. So I found that these reactivate really easily, loads and loads of color, but you guys see how they're flooding the washes? We don't really get like a soft gradation. It's like a very instant flood of color. We're also not getting a lot of granulation. Some colors do offer some, but not really as much as I'd like to see, although this is kind of in keeping with my experiences with Superior Watercolor. So next, I want to try doing some basic color mixing. We have 24 colors to choose from. Technically, we have the colors we would need. However, this is going to give me a good idea of how these paints mix colors in general, how I might get some secondary colors in general, and it's just going to give me some ideas about how these paints handle before we do the wet into wet test. So with color mixing, some mixes are really weak. Anything with that cool yellow is going to be weak. The warmer yellow is much better for mixing colors. The Quin Rose mixes really well with the cool blue and the warm blue for some really nice purples, particularly with the cool blue. I'm able to mix a Payne's Gray, but it seems like it wants to granulate out into the two separate colors. Granulation is really apparent with these watercolors while they're still wet. So while this finishes drying, I'm going to do the wet into wet test. We have just a little bit of room over here, but it'll give us a good idea of how these paints handle when introduced to a lot of water and how they mingle and how they mix in a wet into wet setting. Since we have a lot of testing to do today, we're going to do a mini wet into wet down here at the bottom of the page. The colors don't dilute as much as the Mei Liang tube watercolors, and while they do move somewhat in the water, they don't diffuse out as much as some of the other brands that I've tested. And I noticed as it dried, and you guys will see that in a minute, that colors move somewhat, but I don't think these have a lot of oxgall in them. I'm seeing some harsh delineations that might be scaling as it dries. And the colors seem to stay fairly bright as they dry. Some colors do have a tendency to take over the whole, and you guys can see I used a lot of really bright, assertive colors. The wet into wet test is mostly dry, but it's not fully dry. I'm going to put it aside so that we can swatch Superior against Superior. Now for my second Blick cold press pad. And I have our Artify watercolors. So these are a rebrand or a white labeling of Superior student grade watercolors. And then I have our Superior 48 colors master level solid color. So we're going to be swatching all three of these today. Now, in the past, I have done full Superior reviews where I even did the field test. I have not field tested this set or this set. However, I did field test Superior Farben, and Superior Farben is yet another this palette rebranded. So when all these companies are working under different names, it can get really confusing. It can be kind of challenging to test out all these things and to keep everything kind of lined up and neat and tidy in our minds. Now, the Superior Master Level Solid Watercolor, and this I actually have not field tested, so I may end up field testing this one soon, but this is a 48 color set, and we have 24 colors in the tubes, and I don't necessarily feel like just picking out the colors that are in both sets. So we're just gonna have to put our thinking caps on and use our imaginations. However, I believe this is a 24 color set here. So the order I think I'm going to do these is, I think I'm gonna start with this set, do the tube set in the middle, and then do the professional set on the other side. We're starting out with the Artify 24 color set. This is a Superior product. The colors in this palette are white, skin color, lemon yellow, cad yellow, yellow orange, orange, orange red vermilion, cad red light, alizarin crimson, permanent rose, mauve, cerulean blue, marine blue, Prussian blue, permanent green light, olive green, chrome green, hooker's green, yellow ochre, pale red, burnt umber, Payne's gray, and ivory black. And I'll have these listed out for you guys in the description below. The color palette is a little bit different than the 24 color. It includes a white and a skin color, but also includes a Payne's gray that reads as black. This palette is really heavy on the oranges and reds, but all the colors are really fun and bright with a good punch of color. And this might be a great option for a brush letterer or floral watercolor artist looking for a fun student grade set at an affordable price. Next up are the tubes, the Art Whale tubes, but again, we're thinking these are Superior. I've already covered what colors are in this palette. I'm still swatching them in the same order. The colors are slightly different from the Artify. It seems like it's a bit better balanced in terms of color inclusion. More blues, a dioxine purple, more earth tones, and fewer oranges. It includes a black and an indigo, and they might be a little bit more opaque than the Artify. Is our Superior Master Level Solid Watercolor palette. This is a 48 color palette, and I will have these listed out for you guys in the description as well, but we have titanium white skin, Naples yellow light, permanent lemon yellow, cadmium yellow medium, permanent yellow medium, transparent medium yellow, gamboge, Indian yellow, cadmium orange yellow, cadmium orange, permanent orange red, scarlet magenta, Chinese red, cadmium red, rose red, madder red, violet, royal purple, permanent violet, cobalt blue, indigo, and French ultramarine, the peacock blue, sea blue, Prussian blue, penny gray, Payne's gray, turquoise light, turquoise deep, malachite green, emerald green deep, hooker's green, brilliant olive green, tree green, permanent green, yellow green, lemon sienna, yellow ochre, maple yellow, raw umber, Pazuli red ochre, Van Dyke brown, burned sienna, burned brown, and ivory black. This 48 color palette is really heavy on the yellows, oranges, and reds, and many of them seem repetitive. Whenever Superior does a Naples yellow, it's always weirdly weak and kind of gray. It might be better off if they didn't include one at all, particularly in palettes like this where it is so one color family heavy. Some of the master level neutrals are really hard to activate despite pre-activating them with a spritz of water earlier. This is supposed to be the highest level Superior offers, but I'm not sure if it's a really big improvement on the tubes or on the student grade set. And Superior doesn't make their pigment info easily available. Swatching all three palettes was really pretty interesting. You can see a lot of similarities, but you can also start to see some differences. So the student grade Artify rebrand set, similar colors, but everything is maybe a little less saturated, not like enough that you would notice it immediately. You really have to look at it, but a little more subdued. Like some of these colors are not as saturated as others. Some of the neutrals are not as saturated, that sort of thing. Then we have the tubes here in the middle, and these are really pretty saturated. Good color payoff, reactivate really easily, a whole lot of color. Even the neutrals reactivate pretty well. Finally, we have their master level paints, and these are just so heavy on the yellows and the oranges and the reds, and then you barely get any of the other colors. The neutrals also don't reactivate as well as the neutrals in the tube set. Of the three palettes here, I think the tube set has kind of the best color balance. We get a few yellows, we get some reds, but we also get a good mix of the other colors. Also, they insist on including what they call Naples yellow, and it is just one of the weakest colors they have. I really do not see and I love a good Naples yellow. I have a good Naples yellow in my daily driver palette. It gets a lot of use. I love a nice buttery Naples yellow, but this is not that at all. After swatching all of these, I've decided that I'd like to field test one of them, and I'm leaning towards the tubes. The 48 palette just has too many of the same colors that are just so similar, and the 24 tube palette does a better job of culling it down, and the neutrals were easier to activate than with the tubes. So I think we're going to be field testing this palette next. Their swatch sheet with the tubes actually includes pigment, light fast, and transparency info, unlike the swatch sheet for their master level half pans. This is a really saturated palette for the most part. The light oxide red is pretty similar to the burnt sienna, although the burnt sienna contains a PBK 11. The olive green appears more brownish than I'm used to with olive greens, and the cobalt blue PB 29 and PW 6 is more muddy than I'm used to, and is probably not a real cobalt, despite not saying cobalt blue hue, which would indicate it's not a real cobalt. I just did the lift test for the swatches that have been dried for more than a week, as well as the swatches that are fresher and a little bit newer. These have a thicker application because they were applied while the paints from the tube were still wet in the half pans, and these, were applied with thinner, more paint controlled swatches because I was working from dried reactivated half pans. In general, I find that these are, I expected the neutrals to lift more. Some of the neutrals down here lifted more. I expected these to lift more. In my experience, Venetian red, Indian red, Patchouli red tends to be more lifting since it's an earth pigment that is less finely granulated. I expected the granulating blues to be more lifting. The purple's fine. I'm a little surprised at how much I could pick up from the magenta, but it might not be a Quin magenta. They just didn't really lift the way I expected them to lift. That said, my prior experiences with superior watercolors, particularly the chiclet ones, those are the ones that got a full field test in addition to the student grade ones under the Shapiro Farben line. I figure these are probably going to handle well. I am going to field test these, and I'm probably going to do it on a cotton rag paper, but I'm a little surprised by these results, but also kind of not surprised, because with a lot of these Chinese brands, they just don't quite handle the same way I'm used to seeing, whether they're more finely granulated or they're using a different binder or they have more optical brighteners in there. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the field test is actually going to reveal about superior tube paints. Before I start painting, I'm going to make a palette map that represents this palette where all of the colors are, so that it's easier for me to grab and mix colors without having to think about it too hard as I'm painting. This makes it so much easier to paint, and if you don't do this, I really recommend that you do. So I am going to start by mixing up a background wash, and I wanted something that was really warm and really inviting and friendly, and I wanted to try something a little bit differently. So I grabbed some warm yellow and yellow ochre. I mixed them up into a wash. I found that these still hold some color and they don't lose all chroma in a wash. They handle decently with pores, and they didn't dry as opaque as I expected, and they didn't cloud the line art too badly, which I fully expected them to do. So when painting the flowers, I noticed that the warm yellow activates quickly and really packs a wallop. You really need a palette to help with color control. It's mostly unremarkable, maybe a little thicker and more opaque than some professional grade paints that I've talked about here, maybe not quite as saturated. Right now I'm working with limited mixes and fairly thick color, so it's a little bit hard to tell. I also didn't want to push these too much with the glazing because I didn't really feel like they were up to the challenge. As I work on layers though, like the green and yellow flowers, I feel like this paint is kind of stodgy and handles stiffly for watercolor. Like May Marie Blue has a lot of opacity to it, but it isn't necessarily stodgy. You can get some really nice clean layers, and I have a full review where I talk about that if you guys are interested in checking it out. I can't help but compare the two because they are both wildflower theme, and they were both from Lilliputian Living Volume 7, and they were done kind of in sequence. With the Art Whale watercolors, these handle more like a student grade. I'm painting on arches, so I know it's not the paper, it's not the sizing or anything. Like the colors seem to dry kind of flat, whereas nicer professional watercolors dry with a bit more dimension. I decided to attempt a spray to loosen things up, and then paint in some hints of blue and the hot pink and maybe some yellow in the background to just kind of liven things up, because I felt like at this point it was looking very green. Wet into wet with the blade-like leaves doesn't seem to go very far because this is a very stodgy paint. I did a lot of color mixing so the colors wouldn't be so straightforward primary, like we're seeing straight from the tubes themselves or straight from these half pans. There was some color movement when I sprayed them, even after drying. So in a way that's good. At least we got some vibrancy, we got some movement, we got some liveliness going on because it was looking really stiff and stodgy. So I came back to it the next day. For how I paint, colors feel kind of muddy and dull. They seem to dry desaturated and seem like they apply kind of chunky. I can already tell that I'm going to have to re-ink this piece because it's obscuring the line art too much for my liking. I think these probably fall more student grade than professional grade for me. The cool yellow has like no coverage. So some notes I made while painting the person: I was able to mix a decent skin tone. I was able to mix a decent hair color. I was able to mix a decent shadow color. The rose petals, the wet into wet can be really patchy. And this isn't meant as a tutorial. This is the field test. This is me walking you guys through what I think about the paints. If you guys are interested in tutorials where I talk about how I draw and paint people, I've got a big playlist, and I also have some start to finish tutorials that I think you guys might enjoy and might check out. Also, the narration does not necessarily line up one-to-one with what I'm doing on the screen because I take notes as I'm painting. So I'm kind of trying to balance reading my notes and making sure I cover those points and then also hitting some additional points that I might notice while I'm doing the narration. So on the third day, I start adding shadows and refining colors and adjusting things. And I'm not quite at that point yet. The second day, I was able to get a lot of color on the paper. I was able to spend several hours painting that day, so I was able to make a lot of progress. I'm also painting with this ceramic palette that I happen to really love. It is a big, deep weld palette. This thing is really cool. I have a video coming up where I talk about different ceramic palettes that I like and that I find useful. I'm just going to remind you guys, I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, so how I handle things and how I do things might be different from what you do and how you're looking at things and what you need in paints. So I try to disclose my bias to help you guys make informed decisions. I'm not saying the paints that I like are the best paints. I'm not saying the paints that I dislike are the worst paints. I'm really saying they're the best paints for what I'm doing at this point in time, or they're the worst paints for what I'm doing in this point in time. And if you paint kind of like I do, you might find that helpful. So third day, adding shadows, refining colors, and adjusting things. So I do like this illustration. I think it's charming, but it was charming even in the inks. I think with higher quality watercolors that offer more transparency or translucency, or opaque colors that were able to stand up in mass tone, this could have really shown up. I'm sort of comparing it against the field test image from the Mer Marie Blue field test, since they're companion pieces that both feature blondes with bright flowers, and that might be a bit unfair to the Art Whale watercolors, as the Mer Marie are high quality professional grade watercolors, and these are more like a student grade. I would even say perhaps a step down from the Vermilion pigments tubes, which are definitely marketed as a student grade. Now, that said, these are decent for a beginner, inexpensive, you get a lot of paint, and you're going to use a lot of paint when you're a beginner. They set up in half pans decently well, they reactivate, they work well with a ceramic palette. I would actually possibly recommend these if you were interested in getting into watercolor on a budget. Again though, I think the Vermilion pigments that we talked about earlier are a better quality, inexpensive paint, but you do get more paint with these while still retaining the working properties of a half decent watercolor. And you guys see I re-inked. I'm kind of cleaning some of the details up. I'm trying to use the opacity of these watercolors to add some additional details here and there. And I'm also using some gouache to kind of bring some color and some liveliness and some brightness back into this. I also want to point out this has been time-lapsed so much. It was time-lapsed 8x and then brought into this video and then time-lapsed 8x again. So here is the finished piece. I think it turned out really cute. I wish the colors had been a little bit cleaner and didn't require so much refinement. Let's talk about the pros and cons of the Art Whale watercolors. And we're going to start with the positives. We're going to start with the pros. These are fairly inexpensive and you get a lot of paint in the tubes. This is pretty comparable to a mid-sized professional grade watercolor tube like a full Winsor & Newton or a full Daniel Smith. The tubes are regular tubes. They're not those weird ointment tubes that we've seen with some cheaper watercolors. For the most part, in mass tone, the colors are bright and saturated. There's a good selection of colors in the 24 color set. They mix decently well to mix up secondary colors, and they layer decently well to make some nuanced gradients. Well, what about the cons? Unfortunately, the Art Whale watercolors are just not as good as the Vermilion pigments. Like, they're not bad, they're just not as good as the competitor. And, you know, as an American who purchased both of them from Amazon, I'm kind of judging accessibility by that. I found them both on Amazon. They were both in about the same price bracket. And while the Vermilion pigment tubes are admittedly smaller, I did get the 36 color set as opposed to the 24 color set. And I'm not entirely sure if the Vermilion pigment tubes are available in tubes this large, but I felt like they handled just a lot better than the Art Whale. Some of the colors in this set are kind of weak. Some of the colors are weirdly too opaque, like they've been extended with optical brighteners rather than it being the pigment strength. And all of the colors dry, kind of muted and muddy. So what's my verdict on the Art Whale / probably superior watercolors? These are okay, but sadly not really good enough for me to want to use them in kits or to really recommend to you guys. If you guys watch this channel, you know I review student grade and professional grade watercolors regularly, so I've experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly of watercolor paints. All of this experience does make me kind of picky, especially when I'm recommending that you go out and spend money. I want y'all to have a positive experience with watercolor because watercolor and comics are my favorite mediums, and they are my favorite in combination. Poor paints will make it so much harder for you to love watercolor. Unfortunately for Art Whale, Superior, I like their other formats better, particularly in the folding screen palette. And I recently reviewed Vermilion Pigment's tube paints, and I felt like those had more of the qualities that I'm looking for in an affordable, high-quality student grade. I don't feel like Art Whale or the Vermilion Pigment tubes really count as professional grade watercolors, although Art Whale is positioning itself as such, and I'll include some footage from Amazon to demonstrate what I'm talking about. I want to make it clear that I don't consider these professional quality, although they are quite good as a student grade. So would I recommend them? If you're looking for a student grade watercolor and you don't want to use the Vermilion pigments, or you don't have access to the Vermilion pigments, and you don't have access to some of the other superior formats that I've talked about here on the channel, these are fine as a student grade. That said, I like pretty much not anything better than them. That's an unfair statement, but there's so many qualifiers to this that it's really just hard for me to recommend them without giving you those qualifiers. I like the folding palette set better than this for watercolor. I have a field test of a Lilliputian living character that I was really impressed with. I was really impressed how the folding screen style palette handled, and that's also a Superior product. I have tried out their their half pan watercolors, and I believe I like those a little bit better as well. These just are not really professional grade to me. They cannot do what I would want to see from professional grade watercolors, and they're just not as good as the Vermilion pigments as a student grade watercolor. So they're hard for me to recommend because there's just things that I like better. They're not terrible. If you have them, you can definitely make art with them, and I think you'll be pretty happy with them. And they are still capable of a lot of the things that we want to see from a good student grade watercolor. They're just competing in a saturated market, and they're just not quite there. I feel like my verdict pretty much summed up most of my feelings about these watercolors. I will admit I am a little bit disappointed by these. I have tried their other products in the past, and maybe it's the form factor that has me charmed. Maybe that adds an extra layer of novelty to it. Maybe they just handle a little bit differently, but I like their chiclet style watercolors a bit better than I like their half pans and their tube watercolors. And I guess this is just kind of a unilateral thing. I painted this field test with them, and while they handled better than many of the student grade watercolors we have talked about in the student grade showdown, it still wasn't to the level that I was really hoping to see from these. And they didn't quite live up to my expectations set from some of my other reviews of this brand, or from comparable Chinese student grade to professional grade watercolors like the Vermilion pigments. They did swatch quite promising. They are very saturated, they are very brilliant, they have a lot of immediate color payoff, and their neutrals aren't bad, which frankly, when it comes to inexpensive student grade watercolors, the neutrals always suffer the most. And the secondary color mixes were very pretty with some interesting granulation. I also comparative swatched them against the Artify. So those would be a white label of Superior. The Artify is their student grade ones, the Art Whale 24, and then the Superior Master palette. And that's the only palette I know well, it's the only palette I swatched today that I know for a fact is superior. That said, literally everything about this palette points to being a white labeled superior watercolor palette. So, I mean, look how pretty these are. These are not the best fit for me. They are not a good fit, I think, for my watercolor kits. The Vermilion tubes are a better fit if I decide to go in that direction. I'm kind of hesitant because it is going to be a lot of money on my end to release those kits. So still kind of thinking about it before I release it. So if that's something you guys would like to see from me, let me know down in the comments below. I need to know that there's a market for them. But I do think there's an audience for these. I think folks who do maybe loose watercolor florals where you want that bold, impactful color payoff, but you're not doing a lot of color mixing, you're not watering it down a whole lot, and you're not working with a line art, these could be a great fit for you. Same goes for brush letterers who work under the same sort of circumstances. But if you work with a line art, these are gonna muddy it pretty significantly. And if you think these are professional grade watercolors, and I'll be fair with you guys, the listing treats it like these are artist quality watercolors. Like these are something that you can put through all the paces and hold them to the same kind of expectation that you might with other professional brands. These ain't it. These are not it. Basically, I couldn't help it. I was mentally comparing these the whole time to the Marmary Blue watercolors. Those are a really, really nice professional watercolor that I reviewed recently, so they're at the top of my brain. And to the Vermilion Pigments tubes, which have been kind of like a strong contender on this channel for a long time. And I reviewed those recently as well. And they're just not, they're not professional enough. They don't really hold a candle to the Marmary Blue, and they're not as good in my opinion as the Vermilion Pigments. And I wish I could, it's a bunch of little things really, and your experiences might differ just enough that you really like these. And if you fall into that category, let me know down in the comments below. I am absolutely not here to yuck anybody's yum, to tell you you are a bad artist for using something that just didn't spark joy with me. I'm here to help people get a different perspective on a watercolor palette they might like, or to decide whether or not the watercolors are a good fit or a good investment for them, or particularly if you do people cartoony art and comic art like I do, if these will be a good fit for the kind of art that you want to make. That's really all I'm trying to do here. Now, this palette was made possible thanks to the generosity of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. The funds for my Patreon go into purchasing the supplies that I use here and the things that I review here on the channel, whether it is watercolor paper, and this was painted on arches, or it's the watercolor paints that we're talking about. Their support helps provide those consumables. So thank you guys so much for your support. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I hope this review was helpful. I am having a hard time really just articulating like the nuances of why I don't like these paints all that much, why they were disappointing for me, but I'm gonna talk about it. I did talk about it a lot in the field test, and hopefully I broke it down in a way that you guys can kind of see where I am coming from. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon with another art supply review, tutorial, or artist chat. Bye guys!